Topic 43, the 1920s. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to identify and describe the general political, economic, and cultural trends of the 1920s and explain and give examples of the paradoxical tension between the forces of modernism and anti-modernism during the 1920s. When most of us first think about the 1920s, we conjure up images of glamorous flappers guzzling bathtub gin made necessary by the prohibition against the sale of alcohol ushered in by the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. While the 1920s were, of course, more complicated than a single image, this scene does capture the most important paradox of the decade. The forces of modernism unleashed after World War I made it possible for women to venture out unaccompanied by male chaperone, wearing dresses their mothers considered scandalous and engaging in behaviors like smoking cigarettes, dancing to a new music called jazz, first made by and for African Americans. On the other hand, the world the flappers and others stepped into reacted strongly against those same modern forces, prohibiting alcohol, denying scientific theories like evolution, forcing immigrants to shed their ethnic identities to become 100% American, and maintaining the systems of racial segregation through law in the South and housing and job discrimination in the North and West. Many have remarked that the 1920s was the 20th century's first quote-unquote modern centuries. In many ways, this is true. Not the least because 100 years later, we continue to see the forces of modernism and anti-modernism battle for the soul of the United States in the public square today. After the reform-minded 19-teens and the unimaginable losses of World War I, many Americans sought a retreat from internationalism and desired to enjoy the bounty of the nation's industrial capitalist economy. The Senate never ratified the Treaty of Versailles, which would have made the U.S. a member of the League of Nations, which Democratic President Woodrow Wilson founded with his 14 points. With a few exceptions, the U.S. pursued a policy of isolationism, or cutting itself off from the outside world, during the 1920s. The first president of the new decade, Warren Harding, promised Americans a return to normalcy, which he and his successors, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, delivered in the form of an abandonment of progressive-era regulation of the economy and a return toward laissez-faireism of the Gilded Age. Former businessman Andrew Mellon oversaw the Treasury Department during almost the entire decade, lowering taxes, especially on the wealthiest Americans, and decreasing government spending in an attempt to cut the nation's World War I debt. While he did so, these policies made Mellon and the 3 Republican presidents, especially Herbert Hoover, unpopular with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. The industrial economy that had grown during the first 2 decades of the century gathered steam during the 1920s, propelled in part by the decreased tax burden and regulatory oversight promoted by Washington. No corporation exemplified the Roaring Twenties more, perhaps, than the Ford Motor Company. Thanks to Henry Ford's improvements to the assembly line and interchangeable parts technology, he dramatically increased production in the 11 years between 1914 when he was already making more cars than all other automakers combined, in 1925. One Model T emerged from the assembly line every 1.5 hours in 1914. By 1925, every hour saw 375 to 416 cars roll out of the factory. This massive increase in production, combined with a price between $200 and $400, roughly only $3,500 to $5,000 in today's prices, made the Model T Ford within the reach of every middle-class family. Indeed, consumption of many products, from cars to radios to self-improvement courses, grew tremendously throughout the decade. Americans' purchasing habits were due in part to declining prices, but the rise of advertising during the 1920s also prodded them to purchase products they'd never even realized they'd needed before. Advertising agencies invented the term halitosis, for example, to pathologize bad breath and encourage Americans to buy the newly invented product Listerine. As advertising spread across the country, unique local cultures slowly weakened in the face of a stronger national consumer culture often developed among elite ad agencies on Madison Avenue. The homogenization of culture that occurred during the 1920s was not just geographic, but also ethnic and racial. After the peak years of immigration around 1906 and 1907, foreign migration declined sharply with the outbreak of World War I. Nevertheless, the large presence of immigrants in major U.S. cities like New York encouraged Congress to pass the National Origins Act in 1924. This law curtailed immigration from countries outside Northern and Western Europe to a trickle. Meanwhile, the foreign-born already inside the United States were forced to abandon their languages and cultures at work and at school. Former presidents such as Teddy Roosevelt and industrialists like Henry Ford promulgated 100% Americanism, in which being loyal to one's adopted country meant publicly shunning the place of one's birth. Scientists and public figures also espoused the pseudoscience of eugenics, which advocated that Americans from old stock should find others with blonde hair and blue eyes and have more children together in order to counteract the fertility of those new immigrants whom they believed to be genetically inferior. In fact, the racist theories underneath eugenics inspired the National Origins Act in the hopes of keeping America genetically strong. Unfortunately, animus against those outside the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant norm was hardly confined to immigrants during the 1920s. As African Americans left the Jim Crow South after World War I for economic opportunity in the North and Midwest, they encountered racism not unlike what they'd left behind. The second Ku Klux Klan emerged in the 19-teens in Indiana. It soon followed African Americans who comprised the Great Migration and added Catholic and Jewish immigrant targets to its list. Race riots broke out in northern cities like Chicago that experienced new sizable African American migration after World War I. Despite this persecution, however, African American culture flourished during the 1920s, producing the literary and artistic currents of the Harlem Renaissance, embodied by Langston Hughes, as we see here, as well as what some have called the greatest American art form, jazz. Born from the mixture of New Orleans blues and the modern sounds of northern cities like Chicago and New York, jazz provided the soundtrack for the 1920s. Its fast, syncopated rhythms inspired new dances like the foxtrot and the Charleston, being performed here by famed performer Josephine Baker, made also possible by women's new look, from loose-fitting dresses with shorter hemlines and hair cut short into a more masculine bob. Just as many Americans feared the new racial and ethnic makeup of cities, so too did many react against the newfound social and political freedoms of women who had finally been granted the right to vote in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Social conservatives from the rural South and Midwest also reacted strongly against the rising power of science in American life, most notably during the so-called Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Substitute teacher John Scopes was accused of teaching human evolution in Tennessee, a violation of its Butler Act. In a trial that pitted three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan arguing for the state against defense attorney Clarence Darrow, the jury found Scopes guilty after only 9 minutes of deliberation. Tennessee's Butler Act, meanwhile, was not rescinded until 1967. The Scopes trial and its aftermath is just one more illustration of the core tension of the 1920s, as the forces of modernism and industrial capitalism opened up opportunities for women, immigrants, and people of color. Many Americans grew nervous of the changes that seemed to be coming too fast and too frequently. These anti-modern forces dug in their heels, hoping to recreate an American past that existed perhaps only in their imagination. Perhaps this tension has yet to be resolved. Remember the learning objectives for this podcast. Write each one out in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all the learning objectives above. Good luck!